theme for tonight is entitled The Moon, Gateway to the Stars, and we have an amazing lineup of people from which we're going to kind of garner as much information as we can, and of course you will be involved in that discussion as well. We're going to also think about the collaboration of scientists, engineers, how politics is important, businesses are important, the education is important, and then all of this within the framework and the ethics. So really, whatever field you're from, whatever field you might belong to in the future, there's some very tiny ones here in the front row, you all could have a part to play in space. So without further ado, please let me introduce our amazing panel to you. Sat here, we have Jerry Sanders, whose actual title I had to shorten to lead technical expert for in situ resource utilization. We'll come back to this perhaps during the course of the conversation tonight. That's ISRU for NASA. Right next door to him from ESA, the European Space Agency, we have David Parker, who is Director of Human and Robotic Exploration. And then we have our astronaut, Matthias Maurer, also from the European Space Agency. Next door, we have from our very own Luxembourg Space Agency, Marc Serres, the CEO of the Luxembourg Space Agency. And then from the Colorado School of Mines, we have Angel Abud Madrid, the Director of the Center for Space Resources at the Colorado School of Mines. And then finally, we have the burgeoning business units. Air Liquide in France, we have Bertrand Bahat, Director of Space Business Unit at Air Liquide. And then ISpace Europe, we have the Managing Director from ISpace Europe, which is based in Luxembourg as well, Julien Lamamy. I hope I pronounced your names correctly. So to kick off, please, Jerry, from NASA and from ESA, I would like to hear the very broad perspectives, first of all, of what you do. And we'll flow through the panel. What do you do?
Okay, so I worked for NASA for about 33 years. For the last 24, I've been trying to figure out how we actually use the resources of space instead of taking everything with us, like the Apollo. So pioneering versus carrying everything with you. And so my job is to work with, first of all, within NASA, our scientists, our technologists, and our human exploration program, to have a cohesive strategy on how we use resources to make human exploration and robotic exploration possible. And as part of that, coming up with investment strategies and working with our international partners and companies to make that happen.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. First of all, perhaps I should say what ESA is. ESA is the European Space Agency. It's Europe's gateway to space. It's the club of countries that came together more than 50 years ago to work together and by sharing knowledge and skills, project Europe into space. We have 22 member states and we work cooperatively also with Canada and many other countries around the world. In fact, almost everything we do is in international cooperation. I myself was trained as an engineer. I'm afraid I am a child of the space age. I was taken to see 2001, A Space Odyssey, when I was 5 years old. I had no idea what that film was about, but I was enthralled by the moon landings, and that took my interest, and I worked in industry designing rocket propulsion systems, then worked in the UK. Government helped set up the UK Space Agency, which had some similar ambitions as Luxembourg has, and I've now been at ESA for the past 3 years.
Matthias.
Yes, I'm Matthias Maurer. I'm one of the lucky 7 guys that we have in Europe. We have 7 active astronauts in the European Astronaut Corps. All of us dream to fly to the moon, to go on extended missions, to go on missions way more complex than the Apollo missions. Thanks to the ISRU, the in-situ resource utilization, we hope that we can build a house, a station on the moon, that we can produce our own oxygen to breathe, our water to drink, also to produce rocket fuel, so to travel deep into the universe, direction to Mars, and to have a permanent settlement on the moon. And that's why I'm here this week, because I want to encourage all these good scientists and technicians to accelerate this work so that we can make this happen.
Good evening. So on our side here in Luxembourg, we are working in the space agency to develop our economic sector here in Luxembourg. And of course, that means that we have a number of initiatives that support private companies in developing their products and services. But particularly here, we have a flagship initiative on the use of space resources. it's very interesting to understand that we came from nothing when we started working on that. It was an idea suggested by a former director of the NASA Ames Research Center, and we all were very astonished that that could be somehow an idea to pursue here in Luxembourg. And we worked a few years on it before starting this initiative. And I must say that in the meantime, a lot of people are as convinced as us that the use of space resources is really the future of the space activities. I think we cannot continue going into space, taking everything with us. The use of space resources is just a must for the future. If we want to do more in space, we have to use these resources. It's the next industrial revolution in space.
Yeah, Lisa said, my name is Angel Abud Madrid, and I have the opportunity to do the dirty work for all of these people here in this place, because I had a research center where we actually look at the basics of how is that we going to collect the lunar soil, how is that we going to extract the resources, how are we going to process them, and it's the basic research that is needed for companies and for space agencies to accumulate the knowledge on this. But more importantly, what I do is I teach. So I'm in touch with those people and those students and professionals that will be some of the first professionals that are going to be working on this field on the next 20, 30, and 50 years as we do more work in the area of space resources.
Good evening, I'm Bertrand Bahat. Today I represent the group Air Liquide this evening. Air Liquide is a French origin company created a century ago actually. And we are the world leader of gas and cryogenics. We are about present in 80 countries. And our core business from the beginning is to master any kind of gas and cryogenic molecule on the entire value chain, from production or extraction and purification to the application of the customers. And I'm personally in charge of the space application for the Electric Group. So I will develop after what we are doing.
Moyen, good evening. I'm with ISpace. ISpace is a lunar exploration company, which means we build spacecraft to connect the Earth to the lunar surface. And that's just the first step to achieve our long-term vision, which is to extend human presence in space by using the moon and its resources, as really a stepping stone. And I'd like to echo a comment that was made by Deputy Prime Minister Schneider about opening the borders to international talent. The Luxembourg office of iSpace was created 2.5 years ago with one person. And then we hired now close to 20 people with 10 nationalities, which is great fun when you have the Rugby World Cup happening at the same time.
Thank you all so much. So it's a really fabulous panel of world-class experts, and we're so lucky to have you all here in Luxembourg this evening, if you don't already live in Luxembourg, that is. I want to come right back to you two, NASA, Isa, Jerry and David. Can you tell us, we're going to look at Apollo 11 in a moment, well, in about 45 minutes or so. It's 50 years since then. Can you tell us how space exploration has changed in that time and what your plans are for your organizations?
Well, that's a pretty broad question. Space exploration has changed slowly over time, but I would say the last decade has been an amazing change. We started primarily as government-run exploration programs. The initial Apollo program itself was driven primarily for political reasons of competition. Once the United States won the moon race, it kind of died out for a period of time, and exploration became something different. What happened after Apollo, though?
Why did it die out, may I ask?
Well, again, space is hard. Space is very risky, especially with astronauts, and space is expensive. Yeah. And so since you won, and the cost benefit kind of went away. However, we learned very quickly that the education that occurred because of the Apollo program, the spin-off of technologies created new businesses. It changed the economy of the United States. There was almost an awakening that space exploration could provide other benefits. And so what we've seen slowly over time is space exploration, especially human exploration, is aiming more and more about other things than just political competition and saying we're the best. It's now about how do we affect society? How do we affect our education, our economy? And how do we better cooperate? So Apollo was done, Russians versus Americans, and moving from the space, first of all, the shuttle and now the space station, it has become incredibly international. We recognize we need to do this in a cooperative spirit. Again, it was all governments to begin with. And now we're seeing an emergence of companies now investing, SpaceX and Blue Origin and other companies realizing that there is capital to be gained. And so that is starting to change the evolution. And I think this week is particularly important because now we're looking even beyond the horizon and where do we want to go and what challenges can we solve for the Earth by doing the things that we're talking about in space.
I mean, you can put it into simple numbers. The NASA budget was consuming 4% of the entire US federal budget in 1966. And by the time of the Apollo moon landing, it had already halved, and it halved again, and it's now only 0.5% of the federal budget. So that tells you about how big the reaction was. Meanwhile, the rest of the world got involved in space. And so you saw through the 70s and 80s and into the 90s the growth of many other areas of space activity. So the audience here, you've all used something from the European Space Agency several times today without realizing it. If you've looked at the weather forecast, 70% of the accuracy of a weather forecast is due to the weather satellites built here in Europe. If you have a modern smartphone, that's receiving the Galileo satellite navigation information. It's the most accurate global satellite navigation system. But European technology has landed us on Titan, the most distant landing made by humanity. But, and you're right, through cooperation, international cooperation. And that the ultimate example of that has been the International Space Station. So it's gone through all of the challenges and difficulties over 20 or 30 years, but now we are living and working permanently in space aboard the space station. As we sit here this evening, one of Matthias's colleagues, Luca Parmitano, has just taken command of the International Space Station. The space station is a place where dozens of astronauts have carried out hundreds of scientific experiments on behalf of thousands of scientists just in Europe. And some of that technology, all the money is spent here, all the technology is developed and can be used back here. And so we're into the era where space is everywhere, but we're also now coming around, finally, or something I've been waiting for, to going forward to the moon.
As your Director General always talks about. So going forward to you, Matthias, you're one of the lucky few who manages to get into space. Again, we're going to watch this film. How has training for astronauts changed? I mean, you were probably not born.
That's right. I wasn't born when they landed on the moon. Actually, we do today some of the training that even the Apollo astronauts did. So we go into the field, we have geological field training. I mean, none of us 7 is a trained geologist. And even the Apollo astronauts, we only had one of them who was a trained geologist. So we need to learn, like, to speak the language of the geologists and to see actually and describe what we find in the field. And once we find the stuff and identify it, then we can think of the second step to extract it, to use it. So it's very important that we astronauts get the training. We don't need this training on the ISS. There we are not going for geology. So basically, in the future, the training will expand. It will get much broader. We will learn how to set up like a station, how to run the station, how to repair the station, how to run all these processes, how to extract the stuff. So in the future, the training will be way more complex and
But that's
broader.
going to take a lot of time and therefore a lot of investment. I'm just thinking in my mind the comparison to learning surgery or something. It's going to be such a huge investment of whose money?
Well, I mean, it's we astronauts. We are sent to space by taxpayers' money at the moment. We also see there like a change in paradigm. We will also see in the future that private astronauts can buy a mission, or like companies can or institutions can fund an astronaut flight. So I believe, like on the forefront, we will always see the government-funded astronauts, and then being followed later on, maybe up to space tourism. So I think we will see a lot of change coming in the next 1 or 2 decades.
Now, Mark, thinking about you, and he's just opened it up into the private sector as well. And I know this week the Luxembourg Space Agency has been hosting so many people from all over the world for space resources. You've been talking about this from the geological point of view, and just the other side, Angel as well. And people in the audience I've recognized, they are from a mining backgrounds in Australia. I can see right in front of me, Carlos there. So tell us about the links between space resources, what astronauts do, and the business side of this thing.
Well, we see the opportunity in the use of space resources because there is an entire value chain behind. So what we talk about here is not only going and extracting a material somewhere on a celestial body. I think the real opportunity is because you will use this material, you will refine it, transform it, make maybe more sophisticated products out of it, deliver them, and this will also, I would say, require the need of energy, of communications, of storage, of transportation. So when you look at from the broadest sense, it's a whole new economy that you need to build up to make all this happen. And of course, the institutions, agencies will have an important role in the beginning to set up a lot of the infrastructure or the technologies. But our expectation is that, and I think it's even a necessity to make it sustainable on the longer term, you have to involve the private sector as well. And what we try to do, and that's one part of our Space Resources Week, was to stimulate the dialogue between the terrestrial mining industry and the space community, because they don't speak the same language. It's simply two different worlds, but when you take the time to look a little bit into it, you see that there is an enormous potential of synergies. But you know, it's like putting an English-speaking person with a French-speaking person together. They will need to learn one from the other, and first understand mutual their languages, and then, you know, it's also cultural. So it takes time, but we have progressed. I think it's already the second edition that we organize such a summit, and we see that there is an interest, even though terrestrial actors maybe not really be interested in at the first glance. I think things are moving slowly. And again, when we look at all this initiative, it is because on the longer term we have this vision of a real economy, a real value chain that you set up to use the resources up to deliver a service, a product to an end user.
So Angel, he's been talking about the synergies here between terrestrial mining and space mining. The Colorado School of Mines, I think, was possibly the first on Earth to even think about space mining, and then it fizzled out, but it's come back again. So tell us about what your school does and the history within it, and then the synergies.
Sure. As we've been talking about, this new field of space resources will require things like identifying the resources, excavating and extracting them. But like in any new industry through the history of humankind, there's another important factor. You need to train and educate those people that are going to be working on this field. And so at the Colorado School of Mines, for 145 years, we've been educating and training students on how to extract and utilize the resources on Earth. we live right next to the Rocky Mountains, so actually the town of Golden was founded from resources. It was gold and silver when thousands of people came from the East Coast. And so we had a lot of experience on that. About 20 years ago, we started doing research on this field when the word of space resources was only known in a few circles at NASA and probably a few academics. And all along, we started thinking, well, at some point, we will have to educate people on this, but we never felt it was the right time. But about a couple of years ago, in fact, due in large part because of Luxembourg's push into this field, this field started getting very popular. It was no longer the interest of our space agency, but it was about Russia and China and Japan and India and Luxembourg, and last year Europe exploded in interest on this. And also it became the interest of companies, not just the large aerospace companies, but also the small startups that started getting interested in how to get involved in, like Mark said, all the aspects of the value chain of space resources. So we decided that probably was about time, and everything was getting, all of these things were getting together to make space resources important. So we decided to announce that we were going to create the very first program to educate engineers, scientists, economists, policy analysts, everybody that is needed on this field a couple of years ago. And we thought at first, well, maybe we'll have the interest of a few students here in the school. We picked a classroom. We were going to start our classes, and we sent the email to a lot of people around the world. And after a few minutes, we started getting a lot of interest from the school, then from the state of Colorado. By the time we left at night, it was from all over the United States. By the time I came back in the early morning next day, it was the interest from all over the world. So I turned around to my colleague, Chris Dreyer, which probably is in the audience, and I told him, what are we going to do? How are we going to keep our promises of having a program like this? And that's what we thought, well, for a 21st century activity, probably we need a 21st century education technology. And so we decided to launch this program online. And now, after 1 year that has been officially launched, we have students from 4 different continents, about 12 different countries, 80 students from all sorts of professions, which have become involved in this field. And this tells you the interest and the excitement that it's all over the world on getting educated on this field. And not only that, in that this field requires every single profession that's needed, just like on Earth. You need the miners, the geologists, the economists, the roboticists, everybody that is required to work on this field. And so going forward, we thought, well, what would be best than actually to even train the astronauts that are going to do this? And in fact, Matthias has just finished a 2-day professional course that we taught right here at Luxembourg as part of the Space Resources Week. But what if we can even go further? What if Matthias is on his way to the moon? And we can tell him what he's going to be doing on the surface of the moon. And when he gets there, when he picks up the soil, we can even tell him, remember that lesson, Matthias, when you learned what to do with that soil and how to extract the resources? And hopefully he paid attention. And probably we can communicate with him with a few seconds of delay, but probably that will be the ultimate way to expand the education beyond our borders.
And now we're going to really dive into the business part. You can't get to space without propellants, of course. And I know, Isa, when I saw some of the pillars there that you focus on, the percentage of input and thought into propellants is huge for so many reasons. But tell us what Air Liquide does.
Yeah, sure. So for Air Liquide, space is a small chunk of the company, and you understood it. And because originally we were a terrestrial company, let's say 65,000 people, and the business unit I'm in charge of is about 300 people. Still, I'll try to explain how space has become a very, very major driver of innovation for our group, and really appreciate it. We stepped in space about 50 years ago with Ariane launcher. 50 years ago, our president decided to follow this program and to say, okay, we'll offer our cryogenic and fluidic expertise to help you design and manufacture all the cryogenic tank for the launcher, saying that the propulsion of the launcher is done with oxygen and hydrogen. So after 50 years, basically, we did around 700 tanks that flew in space, or that will fly in space in the coming months. Of course, at the same time, we settled in Kourou 40 years ago to produce the propellant on site and to fit in the launcher. So that today on Ariane 6, for example, which is the European new launcher, we are embarked as a cryogenic design authority, and we'll be in charge of all the cryogenic feed lines design and manufacturing. And we are already working on the next generation of launcher that will be using liquid oxygen and liquid methane. So what we've learned about that space launcher story, and what's the takeaway for Earth application? We learn how to manage propellant in microgravity and any kind of flight phases or exotic phases that you will need in the future. So that this competency, for example, is used today for hydrogen mobility in cars. And tomorrow, if we move to aviation with hydrogen, which would be a sustainable, environmental free application, then this competency will be very useful. Second example is a cryogenic system. So 20 years ago, we've decided to go to a cryogenic system to support universe scientific missions. For example, Herschel or Planck, we've designed and manufactured the cryogenic system. For the International Space Station, maybe Matthias, you will use it. We've designed the turbo machine used to refrigerate some samples. And the story I want to tell is that this turbo machine today has been used as a spin-off for Earth application to reduce the boil-off of LNG boats, because the regulation has changed, for example, and you cannot throw away anymore methane on the maritime, and this technology has been used because it was ready and developed for space. Another example is cryo coolers. We have been busy for the last 10 years developing some cryo coolers, so we call that pulse tube cooler. So that's cryo machine cooling down infrared detector of Earth observation satellites. We are currently busy developing about 25 machines. Those machines will serve for satellite to observe the climate, observe the pollutants, and help to monitor the climate change. So Air Liquide is very, very happy to contribute to that challenge. So in that context, I would say that space for Air Liquide is a way to push back the frontiers of the technology, because we often say that space is an extreme environment. So to develop technology in space, we have to be extremely good. And in that context, if we are extremely good, then we'll benefit any kind of Earth application. So last but not least, we really appreciate the initiative of Luxembourg regarding to exploration, because if we look at the last 20 years, everything has changed with new space. And it's absolutely outstanding the way things are moving. I think nobody was anticipating what's happening. The only thing that didn't change is maybe the way we send any kilogram of hardware in space from Earth. Today, 90% of the mass of a launcher is for propellant, just to tear the launcher from the Earth's gravity. So in other words, we can say that Earth is maybe the worst place in the universe to access to space. So what we see is that tomorrow, if from space resources we are able to produce oxygen and hydrogen, let's imagine from water that we could find in the regolith, which is the rock at the surface of the moon, then this will completely change the way we imagine the space missions. And this will make the space missions absolutely sustainable, meaning oxygen for life support, hydrogen for energy storage, oxygen and hydrogen for refueling, so that eventually tomorrow an upper stage of a launcher which is staying in space and which is a bit dying on an orbit destination, maybe tomorrow could be refueled and have another life in space so that we could make space sustainable. And of course, go deeper in space because clearly human being has always been a pioneer and will continue pioneering the universe.
Well, I think ISpace is trying to figure out some of those aspects. Tell us perhaps about water, for example.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. So it may seem funny to some or surprising that we would go to space to look for water. Because, there's water everywhere here. But to echo what Bertrand said, water is the most precious resource in space because companies like Air Liquide can take water and transform that into rocket fuel, energy with fuel cells.
Could you also tell us how much it costs to take water into space?
That was not on your list of questions there.
Somebody will know the actual
yeah, you're
well,
talking about 20,000, 30,000 euros for every kilogram of stuff you put into orbit. And this is a really big constraint on exploration is the cost of transportation.
Yeah, it's about, well, we know with SpaceX, it's about $70 million per launch of the Falcon 9.
One thing just to quickly add, so my colleague from Air Liquide mentioned that 90% of the rocket that launches something into space is propellant. Well, that item that's in space, if you think about trying to land on the moon, for every kilogram you put on the moon requires something like 7 to 10 kilograms to get there. So if a rocket sends, 1 kilogram on the lunar surface, it requires 40 kilograms back in space. So that's, besides cost, what actually gets delivered makes a big difference if you can actually use what's there.
Exactly. And here in Luxembourg, ISpace is very well aligned with the Space Resources Initiative promoted by the Luxembourg Space Agency. We really have the, world-class team that's already preparing today for the prospection of water on the moon. We have a lunar geologist looking at the best landing sites based on orbital imagery, so selecting the safe spots that do have water, planning the exploration on the surface. We have space engineers looking at the best instrumentation that can efficiently detect water and assess how deep it is, how difficult it would be to extract. We have navigation engineers that are preparing to use the technologies developed for autonomous driving on Earth and adapting that for autonomous driving on the surface of the moon so we can efficiently drive around and map out the distribution of water. Because today we know there's water, but our vision is very blurry. We see basically like every pixel that we have about the distribution of water on the moon is 70 kilometers. So we just can go there today and start digging because we have no idea exactly where it is located. So we need to go there with our small robots and do like precise mapping of where the water is. And we've already assembled a team of data scientists that will take all that data and produce those maps that tell us how is the water distributed on the surface. And Lisa mentioned Carlos, which is now becoming very popular in Luxembourg. Carlos is our mining engineer, and he's taking all those maps, all this data, and translating this into information that can be shared with resource industry to say, you guys are used to, going after minerals or other, resources on Earth. Here's one resource in space, water, that's very precious, and we need your knowledge to help us, extract it efficiently and then supply it to future rockets and the future astronauts that will live on the moon.
Just opening it up more broadly now, thank you all for all of this, but thinking about space, sometimes the question comes up, it came up in conversation yesterday, who owns space? When we think about legislation, when we think about other sorts of frameworks aside from engineers and astronauts and scientists, who would like to dive in and explain how we even build up a collaborative, global, Earth-based framework where people can work together in a forward direction, to use Jean Verne's favorite phrase, to think about the moon, for instance?
Well, maybe we should start by talking about why go forward to the moon and what we mean by that. The vision of both the public sector and private sector is a journey outwards. and our horizon goal is Mars. Okay, so horizon goal means that's about as far as I can see. There are places beyond that maybe will go one day, but Mars is about as far as we can see. But people have a conception of how far away Mars is. I always do this, I apologize. That's the Earth. The Earth is the sphere of my hands. It's okay, I can do it. The space station where our astronauts are today is 400 kilometers away. It's about the length of the hairs of the back of my hand. Okay, how far away is the moon? Well, it's somewhere about the second or third row of this lecture, of this theatre, of this cinema. How far away is Mars? It's back to the middle of the city. The distances are huge. You and I use 100 litres of water every day. With recycling technology on the space station, we're down to about 5 litres of water a day. If we're going to go the enormous distances to Mars, we have to develop this capability to live and work in space. And that's why we're going forward to the moon, to live and work there as preparation to the next big leap onto Mars. And that is only going to happen through international cooperation. So it's agencies of every size working together, and it's with industry. And that's stepping beyond what we're already doing with the International Space Station. It's many types of partnerships that are happening around the world now. And that vision of the world working together in competition and in cooperation is the future of space exploration, in my view.
I can see some nodding here. Mark, you were explaining yesterday as well, just about the legal frameworks that Luxembourg tends to be rather good at, in fact, around space.
Yeah, the regulatory framework is extremely important. This gives a certainty to those who want in the future to use the resources. But it's also a difficult topic, because I think doing all that is going much beyond what humanity has ever done. So we have to reinvent all the mechanisms, all the regulations that we would need in the future. And this is a difficult work or serious work that we have to do. We decided in Luxembourg to tackle the issue in 2 steps. First, we have written a national law, and in the national law, we say that the resources that we can find in space can be appropriated. That means that the one who grabs resources will be able to use it and eventually sell it to someone. But it's not enough now that we, Luxembourg, have such a law. This is a topic that is really a topic for humanity. And I would say that the fact that we all talk about the way we could organize in the future the utilization of space resources is extremely important. And there exists a group in the United Nations that follows all the international treaties that deal with space. And this group has now started since 3 years talking, I would say again, because that's not a new topic, of course, about the international regulatory framework for the use of space resources. So that's, I think, an extremely good achievement already. You know, how it is in these big international organizations, it takes time. But I would say that the fact that this dialogue has started now is really, really a very important step in all these discussions. We will need this framework, and it may go faster than we think. I believe in other parts of or other events that we organized this week, there was already this conversation on the timing. And the question, one of the questions is, will we be able to do that within the next 15, 20 years? And the question might be yes. So we have really seriously now to think about how we will regulate all these activities in the future.
Thank you very much, Mark. We've got a few minutes left, I believe. If I've got the nod, we can have about 10 minutes worth of questions, 10 minutes of questions from the audience. So we have people with microphones. Yes, we're going to have 2 microphones here stolen. And if anybody from the audience has a question, Lynn might meet you with a microphone. Just do stand up. There's a question from a lady here.
Thank you a lot for the introductions and for the explanations. It's a very interesting panel and a very interesting conversation. Apart from looking for water needed for fueling, what other resources are we after and for what uses? Perhaps even for terrestrial uses? What other resources are we after?
Lots of answers coming your way.
So here again, I think fundamentally the question is why would we go after resources and how would we use them? So step 1 is rocket propellants. That allows us to travel. It's like gasoline. If you imagine trying to drive across Europe and you can only fill up your car where you started from, how big does your car need to be? How much does it have to carry? So rocket propellants is the first one. And as was mentioned, there are different types of rocket propellants. Oxygen is, just like on Earth, you need oxygen and a fuel. So step 1 is water has both oxygen and a fuel, so it is one of those resources of interest. However, oxygen on its own is a tremendous benefit for breathing, as well as for rocket propulsion and other things. Interestingly enough, the rocks, the dirt on the moon called regolith, 40% of its mass is oxygen in the form of different minerals. So those minerals broken down to extract oxygen is one of the other resources. We're now talking about additive manufacturing on Earth. How do you make spare parts? There is tremendously interesting metals, aluminum, magnesium, iron, titanium on the moon. So instead of bringing everything from Earth and waiting for a cargo ship that may be 6 months away if something breaks, then, okay, maybe I can extract those metals. We talk about trash processing. So it's not just the resources there, but if you have waste and packing material, that is a resource. How do we convert that back into something usable? So we talk about converting waste into plastics, which then can go into radiation shielding or even 3D printing. So there are a lot of natural resources as well as resources that we bring with us along the way. So making things, I think a colleague mentioned about making habitats. So, for example, our current paradigm is we bring a can, a habitat, and it goes there. And if you've ever seen pictures inside the International Space Station, they're pretty crowded, and that's much bigger than Apollo was and such. So imagine if you can actually build a house and have lots more interior and have protection from the sun and such. Those are the goals. So building materials. So a lot of things that we do on the moon now can translate to Earth. How do we recycle? How do we clean water? How do we get energy? Fuel cells was mentioned, hydrogen technologies. So that's spinning back to Earth. And for example, I started my career trying to figure out how to make propellants on Mars for the astronauts to come home. The 2 resources were carbon dioxide and water. Pretty much trying to do, green energy back 20 years ago.
Say a few words on platinum and helium-3. That's what people always want to know.
Well, and then one of the longer term things is there are rare earth elements and very interesting things on the moon as well. So, for example, platinum, a lot of your electronics today the materials are hard to find. So that's one of the things that we may look at. There's another very interesting substance. It's called helium-3. It's a form of helium that has a slightly different atomic weight. And it could be the fuel of the future. It could enable fusion reactors, but without the radioactive waste that some of the technologies being considered for fusion today that use tritium and deuterium. So that's another one of those resources that might come from the moon and back to Earth to help our society as well.
Thank you very much. I love the way Matthias just added in there. Make sure you talk about platinum and helium-3 because that's what people always want to know, as if it's right on the tip of our brains. Thank you. Any further questions?
Actually, I have a question further on the helium-3 that was mentioned, which is actually very interesting. And I was wondering if someone could give me an update on how far we are in the process of finding helium-3 on the moon.
Well, we know helium-3 is there. The samples that were brought back from Apollo have been tested and found to have helium-3. The problem is that the amount of helium-3 in a sample of regolith is on the order of parts per billion.
I just want to interrupt you a little bit because obviously you've got a good knowledge of the subject we're talking about, but I know our audience is quite mixed. Could we just step back a bit and explain on a much simpler level possibly what helium is?
Okay.
And then work our way up to helium-3.
Okay.
Just for the grand...
So helium is the second smallest molecule, hydrogen being the first. It has two protons and 2 electrons. And normally 2 neutrons. So the 2 protons and neutrons equal a mass of 4. Well, in one case, one of the neutrons isn't there. Once, and I'm not sure what the percentage is. And it turns out that particular form of helium, when smashed together, releases a tremendous amount of energy. So it's considered a fusion fuel. There's really only one organization that I'm aware of that has really looked into mining helium-3, the University of Wisconsin. They've developed some technologies associated with it, but it's still very much in its infancy.
And as a jokey aside, the concept of helium-3 mining famously appears in a really good small budget science fiction movie called just Moon. It came out about 10 years ago now, made by the son of David Bowie.
Well, maybe we can have that for next year's Space Resources Week. We can have Moon, and we can have a nice giggle. And by then, we'll all know about helium-3. Any further questions?
Thank you very much to all speakers. I would like to ask a question about, to the director of the Luxembourg Space Agency mainly, about the role of Luxembourg, let's say, in the first period of this our attempt to go to moon and extract the minerals. What do you see that Luxembourg's role will be in, let's say, top 3 main roles, professions, or participation in this effort? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand that our initiative is not about the moon. I think what we are looking for is really to create this entire value chain. It's about space, the utilization of space resources. Going to the moon for specific resources is one thing, and I believe that for the moon, water will probably be, or that the highest probability is that we will first use water on the moon. Does not mean that other resources cannot, but I think it's important to understand that we do not necessarily focus only on the moon. And secondly, we are here to support the development of the companies. So it's, in fact, not really up to us now to decide exactly what to do, when to do it. What we do is helping companies that have their own ambitions and own goals. So we have one specific company established here in Luxembourg that is sitting here. They are targeting the moon, but we had also in the past a few targeting asteroids, and probably one day we will have some that will target Mars. So it's not only about the moon. Our role here is really at this point in time to stimulate the whole community to progress on that. I think it has been said a number of times, cooperation is really key in all these endeavor, and we have absolutely not the ambition to do that alone in our corner. And so what we are doing at this point in time is really bringing up this topic, convincing the people, creating awareness, and building up also a community in Luxembourg. But this is certainly not sufficient. All the cooperation we try to set up, and I would say first in Europe, the European Space Agency has recently also defined a strategy for the use of space resources, and this is already the next step. We are talking now or working together at the European level, and then it comes to the next level where we go together with other partners around the world to the surface of the moon. So I think we have had a role, and we have still a role, and we will continue being active and position Luxembourg on different aspects of this initiative. But there is so many things to do. We cannot do everything. We will need partners. We will need really to address that on a worldwide level.
I think we have time for 2 more questions from the audience. So one is coming up right now.
Hello. So on Earth, the robots are becoming increasingly automated and gaining autonomy. I was wondering what you think the space mining operations would be like, and what the astronauts' role would be in that kind of future.
Maybe I'll have a go at that one. It's a great question. Our program is called Human and Robotic Exploration, and I always say increasingly it's the combination of the two. It'll be humans and robots working together. Today we're building, if you like, autonomous robots to go to the surface of the moon, to drill below, to find the water ice. We're going to the surface of Mars with our ExoMars mission to drill below, to search for the evidence of past or present life. But we're also working on how the astronauts can control robots. So the experiments where robots are being controlled on the surface of the Earth, controlled from the space station, and when we're on the Lunar Gateway, which is our next step, we'll be controlling robots on the surface of the Moon. And then we'll want to control robots to go into the dangerous, dark places. We're really interested to go to the cold, dark, nasty places on the Moon, because that's where the interesting science and that's where the resources may be, particularly the water. And so it's that combination of humans and robots. And if you then project forward to operational space resources, we're going to have to give a high level of autonomy to those robots, because we're not going to have an astronaut come along and service the machine every day. So it's a fantastic driver of technology in all those areas.
Yeah, and I would add that autonomy is possible when one of 2 things or both happen. One is you understand the operations and you're repeating them over and over again. The other is if you have a tremendous computing capability. Space, at this point, we haven't done the mining operations, and typically space computers, because of radiation shielding and such, are not as highly capable. So to begin with, we'll start with teleoperations, like is done on Earth in mining, and we'll progress to more and more autonomous operations. With respect to astronauts, just like on Earth to a certain extent, you want to get miners away from the dangerous operations. So we don't want to necessarily have the astronaut out there drilling like you see in Armageddon or something like that. But obviously, maintenance and repair, dealing with the unexpected, I think, is the biggest thing of having the astronauts there. You can plan as much as you want, but when you actually get there for the first time and you start operating, that's where, having a person there with the technical background makes a tremendous difference.
And time for one final question. A lucky person, whoever is going to be chosen with... Oh, here he comes.
Yeah, I have a question about food as space resources. I guess Matthias needs to eat at some point when he mines there. Do you have a comment on that?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, astronauts are hungry guys, and we want food in space. So we've already seen experiments on the space station, I believe 2 weeks ago, where we 3D printed the first synthetic meat in space. So I think that could be a way forward. We also have now in Antarctica a module produced or set up by DLR, which is called ISS Eden. So it's a test how to produce, how to grow plants, tomatoes, vegetables, all this stuff. That could also spin in knowledge how to produce that stuff in space. But I believe when we talk about in situ resource utilization, the first thing is looking at the essential stuff like water, like air. And at the beginning, we might bring in the food, and only in a later step, we will like plant it or grow it.
Yeah, and in ESA, we have a long-term research project going on, which is trying to produce a completely closed cycle biological life support system. So there are 6 rats, if I remember well, in a complete closed system where everything is extracted, recycled, turned back into food.
2 other very interesting things with respect to food and astronauts. One is as we go farther, like to Mars, and they have longer and longer trips, we found that nutrients, for example, lose a lot of their potency. So being able to actually make different nutrients while you're on your trip. And NASA has, for example, put out what's called the CO2 challenge, where companies were asked to take carbon dioxide and water and turn them into precursors, different chemicals that could then be turned into nutrients. So that's another form of in situ resource utilization that eventually will help crews as they go farther and farther away.
And maybe to add on that, to illustrate with the Earth technology, the air cabin that you will breathe will have to be purified and regenerated. So there are technology on Earth that we are using on submarines, for example, to extract the CO2, the CO2 from the cabin. And the best use of the CO2 would be to inject it in, let's say, farms to grow vegetables. So we are doing it on Earth, and clearly that could be spent in space for our astronauts tomorrow to grow salads and etc.
Anka, did you want to add something there? I saw a movement for, okay. Well, actually, you do have a point.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one final thing since we're wrapping this up. We have been talking about all the resources that we're going to have from space, water, oxygen, metals, helium-3. But there's one very powerful resource that we have not talked about, and that is inspiration. Inspiration that has a way to motivate and excite grown-ups like us that watch Apollo 11, but also the young ones like Julian's and Mark's kids are right in front of us. An interesting thing about inspiration is that it's a renewable resource, and we know how important renewable resources are here on Earth and in space. So let's make a smart use of inspiration as we start using resources to allow us to explore further, to start staying on the moon, Mars, and beyond, and as we use all that technology to benefit all of us here on Earth.
I'm not sure we can top that, but I was going to open the floor to just give a final 10-second line of inspiration from you all just to close this wonderful panel debate. 10 seconds. What's the best thing about your job, or what most inspires you to think about space and the future of space? It could be anything related to that subject. 10 seconds.
Okay. I'm just excited about the fact that I get paid to do what I'm doing, but it has so much spin back to Earth. It's, yes, we're trying to solve problems. Yes, we're trying to get astronauts to another planet. But at the same time, so much of what we're talking about can be used to make life on Earth better.
Well, I think Europe has a massive heritage of scientific exploration and discovery. And it's an amazing thing that the choice is now there for Europe. Do we want to send the first European explorer to the moon? It's our choice.
As an astronaut, I'm one of the few lucky guys who can actually fly to space, but space is done by huge teams. It's made by collaboration, it's made by international cooperation, and I think that's the part that I like most about being part of the space family, that we can work together and bring humanity forward.
Yeah, I would share as well a bit what Angel just said about inspiration. I think that since I have been working now on this new topic of space resources, it's just unbelievable how the interest has grown around what we are doing. And I think it's so inspirational to do things that, in fact, you dream of. And here we are trying really to make it possible and to make it happen within a lifetime. I hope I will see something before I'm retired, But it's really, really fantastic to be able to work on these type of topics.
Angel, I don't know if you can beat what you've just said.
No.
But have a go. Have a go.
Well said, Mark.
So I would conclude by saying that Earth to space or space to Earth, that's a continuum. And every kind of technology we developed in space will get back to Earth and vice versa. And today, what we are speaking about during this week, everything is possible. Finally, the only hurdle would be imagination, as Albert Einstein is saying, because today all the technology are existing. So I will add one resources to make it happen is cooperation, because clearly without cooperation, without joining forces, this cannot happen. It cannot be the success of one company or one state. It should be a universal challenge, and that's what is nice with space, is that it's a very big message of wisdom.
The final word to you.
Thank you. I think we're trying to build the first building blocks toward a lunar economy, a lunar city in the future. But the truth is that nobody knows here what this will look like. And it's up to the next generation, the little kids, to show us how it's done.
Thank you all so much. My final word to you, thank you very much. We've started a little later than planned, so we'll finish a little later, but I hope you will really enjoy this film. And thank you also to all of the sponsors here, particularly to the Luxembourg Space Agency and SES as well for providing us with this film tonight. And finally, thank you all. We're very privileged to be in your presence. Thank you so much for spending the night with us here in Luxembourg. Thank you all.